The plantation mill on the Harrison estate in Georgia was Elijah Carter's domain, a weathered wooden structure where grain became flour through the steady turning of massive grinding stones, powered by a water wheel that never stopped moving. For 18 years, Elijah had controlled every grain that passed through those stones, transforming wheat and corn into the flour that fed the master's family and generated income through sales to neighboring plantations. But in the summer of 1846, the mill became something darker, a laboratory where an enslaved man who understood grain and grinding better than any educated miller in the South used his knowledge to transform food into poison so subtle that no doctor would ever detect it. Master Richard Harrison died in November after 5 months of mysterious illness that began with digestive problems and ended with complete organ failure. The physicians attributed his death to a wasting disease, never suspecting that the bread he ate daily at breakfast and dinner contained flour contaminated with ground seeds from wild plants that Elijah had been mixing with wheat in quantities too small to affect taste, but large enough to kill slowly over months of regular consumption. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Marcus had been born in 1830, Elijah's only surviving child, after his wife Sarah had died in 1835 from complications following a miscarriage. Father and son had lived together in a cabin near the mill, and Elijah had raised Marcus largely alone with help from other enslaved women on the plantation who provided maternal care the boy no longer had. Marcus had grown up in and around the mill, helping his father with lighter tasks from the time he could walk, learning about grain and grinding as naturally as other children learned to read or write. By age 16, Marcus had become genuinely skilled at milling work, capable of operating the mill independently when Elijah needed to be elsewhere on the plantation. The relationship between father and son was closer than typical because of Sarah's early death and because the mill work gave them constant proximity that field workers rarely enjoyed with their children. Then in May 1846, Richard Harrison lost substantial money gambling on horse races in Savannah and needed to raise cash quickly to pay his debts. Marcus, strong and healthy at 16 with valuable milling skills, brought a good price from a buyer who operated a brutal cotton plantation in Mississippi, where enslaved workers were worked to death within 5 years on average. Harrison sold Marcus without discussion or warning, simply informing Elijah one morning that his son would be leaving that afternoon. Elijah watched Marcus loaded into a wagon, the teenager's face showing terror and confusion about being torn from the only home and family he had ever known. That image of his son's desperate expression would sustain Elijah through 5 months of patient poisoning, reminding him why Richard Harrison deserved to die slowly and painfully from contaminated flour. The year was 1846, and the Harrison plantation occupied 1,500 acres of Georgia bottomland, where cotton grew in fields that generated the family's primary income, but where the grain mill represented an important secondary revenue source. The plantation house stood on a gentle rise overlooking fields that stretched toward pine forests, marking the property's boundaries, a 2-story structure built from brick and timber that reflected the Harrison family's wealth and social position. Behind the main house, perhaps 300 yards distant near a stream that provided water power, stood the mill that had been Elijah's workplace and professional identity for 18 years. The mill was a substantial wooden building 3 stories tall, with the water wheel mounted on the exterior wall where the stream's current turned it constantly during seasons when water flow was adequate. The wheel's rotation drove a system of gears and shafts that transmitted power to the grinding stones on the mill's 2nd floor, where the actual transformation of grain into flour occurred. The building's 1st floor served as storage for grain waiting to be ground, and for finished flour awaiting sale or distribution. The 3rd floor held additional storage and the mechanical systems that controlled the grinding stones operation. Elijah Carter had been born on a smaller plantation in 1810, the son of a field worker who had died when Elijah was young, leaving him to be raised primarily by the enslaved community rather than by any individual parent. At 14, Elijah had been sold to Richard Harrison's father and assigned to work in the plantation mill under the supervision of an elderly white miller named Thomas Webb, who had operated grinding equipment for 40 years. Webb had taught Elijah the mechanics of milling over the following 4 years before age, and failing health forced Webb to retire, leaving Elijah at 18 to assume primary responsibility for mill operations. The knowledge Webb had provided was purely practical and mechanical: how to maintain the grinding stones, how to adjust the gap between them to achieve different flour textures, how to manage the water wheel and transmission systems that powered the operation, how to identify when grain was suitable for grinding versus when it needed additional drying. But Webb's understanding was limited to these mechanical aspects. He knew how to operate the mill, but understood little about the deeper chemistry of what happened during grinding, or how different substances responded to being crushed between massive stones. That deeper understanding came from Elijah's own observations and experiments over 18 years of daily work with grain and flour. He learned through careful attention which varieties of wheat produced which flavors and textures, how moisture content affected grinding results, which corn made the best cornmeal, and which adjustments to the grinding stones created flour suitable for different purposes. He discovered that the grinding process generated significant heat from friction between the stones, heat that could affect the final product's properties. He observed that different seeds responded differently to grinding, some being pulverized into fine powder, while others retained more texture, even after passing through the stones. Most importantly, for what would come later, Elijah learned which wild plant seeds could be ground into powder that appeared identical to legitimate grain flour when mixed in small proportions. The forest surrounding the plantation contained dozens of plant species that produced seeds, and Elijah had studied them during the rare free hours enslaved workers were permitted. Some of these seeds were edible and occasionally supplemented the inadequate rations provided to enslaved workers. Others were toxic to varying degrees, causing illness or death in animals that consumed them in quantity. Elijah paid particular attention to one plant species that grew abundantly in the shadier sections of the forest, a tall perennial that produced small, hard seeds, similar in size and shape to wheat kernels. The plant flowered in late spring, producing seeds that matured by early summer and could be harvested in quantities sufficient for Elijah's purposes. The seeds, when dried, turned dark brown and became hard enough to require significant force to crack, making them ideal candidates for grinding between the mill's massive stones. What made these seeds particularly interesting to Elijah was an incident he had observed several years earlier when plantation livestock had gotten into an area where the plants grew thickly. Several pigs and goats had consumed the seeds mixed with other forage, and within weeks they had developed progressive illness, characterized by loss of appetite, weakness, and wasting, that eventually killed 3 animals before the contaminated feeding area was identified and fenced off. The plantation overseer had attributed the deaths to some natural plant toxin, never investigating further because the problem had resolved itself once animals were prevented from accessing that section of forest. Elijah had paid closer attention, noting which plant had been growing in that area, and observing the timeline of illness in animals that had consumed its seeds. The progression had been gradual rather than acute. The animals hadn't died immediately after eating the seeds, but had sickened over weeks of continued exposure. This suggested that the toxic compounds accumulated in the body over time, rather than causing immediate poisoning, a characteristic that would prove crucial when Elijah decided to use these seeds for purposes their natural defenses had evolved to serve. The Harrison plantation mill processed grain not just for the plantation household, but also for neighboring farmers who brought their wheat and corn to be ground for a fee, typically paid as a portion of the finished flour. This meant that Elijah handled hundreds of pounds of grain weekly, maintaining careful records of which grain belonged to which customer and ensuring that flour was returned to the appropriate parties. The system required organization and trustworthiness, qualities that Elijah had demonstrated consistently enough that Richard Harrison's father had given him increasing autonomy over mill operations. When the elder Harrison died in 1838 and Richard inherited the plantation at age 30, the new master had continued his father's practice of allowing Elijah substantial independence in managing the mill. Richard would visit occasionally to inspect operations and to sample flour quality, but he didn't involve himself in daily decisions about which grain to grind, when, or how to adjust equipment for optimal results. This trust born from Elijah's 18 years of reliable service, and from Richard's own lack of interest in the technical details of milling created the freedom Elijah would need to contaminate flour without detection. Richard Harrison was married to a woman named Elizabeth, who had come from a wealthy Savannah family, and together they had 3 children ranging in age from 8 to 14 in 1846. The family lived comfortably on income generated by cotton sales and by the various secondary operations, including the mill, maintaining a lifestyle that required the labor of 43 enslaved workers who performed everything from field work to household service. Richard considered himself a progressive plantation owner, someone who rarely used physical punishment, and who provided better material conditions than many neighboring estates offered their enslaved workers. But beneath this veneer of relative benevolence lived appetites and habits that made Richard dangerous in ways his father had never been. Richard drank heavily, consumed substantial quantities of whiskey most evenings, and had developed a gambling problem that periodically created financial stress, requiring him to sell property or workers to raise cash. His gambling focused primarily on horse racing, attending meets in Savannah where he would wager amounts he couldn't afford to lose on races whose outcomes he couldn't predict or control. Elijah had observed Richard's gambling problem developing over the 8 years since the master had inherited the plantation, noting how periodic cash needs would result in sales of enslaved workers or equipment to cover debts. These sales had affected other families on the plantation, but had never touched Elijah or Marcus directly, perhaps because Richard recognized that the mill's profitability depended on Elijah's expertise and that family stability helped maintain the miller's reliable performance. That protection had held until May 1846, when Richard's losses at Savannah races exceeded anything he had previously wagered and lost. The debt was substantial, nearly $3,000 owed to men who expected prompt payment, and who had reputations for making examples of debtors who failed to meet their obligations. Richard needed to raise cash immediately, and the quickest way to do that was selling enslaved workers to dealers who would pay fair prices for healthy young people with valuable skills. Marcus, at 16, represented exactly the kind of property that would command premium prices in the slave markets that operated openly in southern cities. Richard had made the decision without consulting Elijah or considering the impact that separating father and son would have on the miller, whose reliable service had made the plantation's grain operations profitable for nearly 2 decades. The master simply appeared at the mill one May morning to inform Elijah that Marcus had been sold and would be leaving that afternoon, as if announcing a routine business transaction rather than the permanent destruction of Elijah's family. Elijah had stood in the mill listening to Richard explain the sale, his external composure maintained through years of practice at hiding emotion from white observers, his internal response a combination of rage and grief so intense it temporarily made coherent thought difficult. He managed appropriate words about understanding the master's business needs, managed to avoid showing the devastation that was tearing through his chest like physical pain. Richard left the mill apparently satisfied that his trusted miller had accepted the situation with appropriate resignation. That afternoon, Elijah watched from the mill as Marcus was loaded into a wagon with 2 other young enslaved workers Richard had sold to the same Mississippi buyer. The teenager looked toward the mill where his father stood in the doorway, Marcus's face showing confusion and terror and desperate hope that somehow this wasn't really happening, that his father would find some way to stop it, but Elijah had no power to stop anything. He could only watch the wagon depart, carrying his son toward a fate that was effectively a death sentence delivered through brutal labor in Mississippi cotton fields. The image of Marcus's face in those final moments, the desperate backward glance as the wagon pulled away, burned itself into Elijah's memory with such intensity that it would remain vivid months later, when he needed motivation to continue the patient work of poisoning Richard Harrison through contaminated flour. The transformation from grieving father to calculating killer began that same evening, conducted in the privacy of the cabin Elijah had shared with Marcus for 16 years, and that now felt unbearably empty with the boy gone. Elijah sat alone in the darkness, his mind working through possibilities and constraints that would determine whether revenge was achievable or whether accepting this latest horror was the only realistic option available to someone whose legal status was property rather than person. Direct confrontation with Harrison was impossible. Any physical attack on a white master by an enslaved worker would result in immediate execution, probably through torture designed to serve as warning to others who might contemplate violence against their owners. Escape was equally impractical for a man of 36, with no knowledge of routes north and no connections to the networks that helped fleeing enslaved people reach free states. Elijah could run, but he would almost certainly be caught within days and return to face punishments that would make continued life unbearable. The only viable path toward justice involved using his position and expertise to create circumstances that would harm Harrison while appearing completely natural and accidental. Elijah possessed knowledge and access that could be weaponized if he was willing to accept the enormous risks involved, and if he could maintain the patience necessary to execute a plan that would take months rather than days or weeks to accomplish. The mill offered possibilities that other work assignments wouldn't have provided. Elijah controlled what went into the grinding process and what emerged as finished flour. If he could introduce contamination that would sicken or kill people who consumed flour over extended periods, and if he could ensure that contamination affected only Harrison's household while leaving other customers' flour pure, then he might achieve revenge that would appear to be nothing more than tragic illness striking the master's family. The wild seeds Elijah had observed killing livestock years earlier provided the weapon he needed. Those seeds, ground into powder and mixed with legitimate grain in small proportions, would be indistinguishable from wheat flour once processing was complete. The toxic compounds they contained would accumulate in the bodies of people who consumed bread made from contaminated flour, creating progressive illness that would mimic natural wasting disease rather than acute poisoning that might trigger investigation. Over the following days, Elijah began planning with the careful attention to detail that 18 years of precision milling work had taught him. He needed to harvest sufficient quantities of the toxic seeds to contaminate flour over several months of Harrison household consumption. He needed to determine the proper ratio of toxic seeds to wheat that would create cumulative poisoning, without making the flour taste obviously wrong or causing such rapid illness that contamination would be suspected. And he needed to establish a system for ensuring that only flour destined for Harrison's household would be contaminated, while flour for other customers and for the enslaved workers' rations remained pure. The harvest began in early June, when the toxic plants had matured their seeds to the point where they could be collected in quantity. Elijah spent his rare free hours, the brief period between finishing mill work and the darkness that ended all plantation activity, walking through the forest sections where the plants grew thickest. He collected seeds carefully, filling a cloth bag he kept hidden in his cabin, gathering perhaps a pound or two of seeds during each expedition. The collection process required several weeks because Elijah couldn't afford to harvest so much from any single area that the depletion would be noticeable to anyone who might pass through those forest sections. He spread his harvesting across multiple locations, taking modest amounts from each plant cluster to ensure that casual observers would see no evidence of systematic collection. By late June, Elijah had accumulated approximately 15 pounds of dried toxic seeds, stored in ceramic containers hidden beneath the floorboards of his cabin. The next challenge was determining the appropriate contamination ratio. Elijah needed to introduce enough toxic material to create progressive illness over months of consumption, but not so much that the flour would taste wrong or cause such rapid poisoning that doctors would suspect food contamination. He began with conservative estimates based on the livestock deaths he had observed. Those animals had consumed the seeds in relatively concentrated form over several weeks before dying, suggesting that smaller doses spread over longer periods might produce the slow-wasting illness Elijah wanted to create. Elijah settled on a ratio of approximately 1 part toxic seeds to 50 parts wheat by weight, a proportion small enough that the ground seeds would be nearly undetectable in the finished flour, but substantial enough that regular consumption would introduce cumulative doses of toxin into Harrison's body over months of daily bread eating. This meant that for every 50-pound bag of flour Elijah produced for the Harrison household, he would include 1 pound of ground toxic seeds mixed throughout. The grinding process itself provided perfect cover for this contamination. Elijah would prepare batches of grain specifically for Harrison household flour, adding the toxic seeds to the hopper along with wheat before grinding began. The massive stones would pulverize both types of seeds into indistinguishable powder, creating homogeneous flour where toxic material was distributed evenly throughout. No visual inspection or taste test would reveal the contamination because the proportion was too small to create obvious differences from normal flour. Implementation required careful organization to ensure Elijah never confused contaminated flour with safe product. He established a system using subtle marks on the flour bags, a small notch cut into the cloth near the top seam on bags containing poisoned flour, a mark that would be invisible unless someone knew to look for it, but that allowed Elijah to identify which bags were deadly and which were safe. Contaminated bags would be delivered to the Harrison household kitchen, while unmarked bags would go to other customers or to the enslaved workers' rations. The first contaminated batch was ground in early July, approximately 6 weeks after markers had been taken away. Elijah worked alone in the mill as he always did, the familiar rhythm of the grinding stones providing cover for actions that would have resulted in his immediate execution if discovered. He measured out 50 pounds of wheat from the plantation stores, adding 1 pound of the toxic seeds he had harvested and dried. The mixture went into the hopper that fed grain between the massive stones, and Elijah watched as wheat and poison were crushed together into powder that fell into collection bags beneath the grinding platform. The finished flour looked completely normal, fine white powder with the slightly sweet smell characteristic of freshly ground wheat. Elijah examined it carefully, running the flour through his fingers to check its texture, observing its color in the mill's dim light. Nothing about the contaminated flour would alert anyone to its deadly properties. The toxic seeds had been pulverized so thoroughly that no visible traces remained, their poison distributed invisibly throughout wheat flour that appeared identical to the safe product Elijah had been producing for 18 years. Elijah marked the bag with his subtle notch and set it aside for delivery to the Harrison household, then proceeded to grind several batches of uncontaminated flour for other customers whose grain was waiting to be processed. The contrast between the two types of flour was only in Elijah's knowledge to any observer. All the bags looked identical, containing the same quality product the Harrison mill was known for producing. The delivery system was straightforward because it was already established through years of routine practice. Each week Elijah would send finished flour to the main house kitchen, where the household cook would use it for baking the breads, biscuits, and pastries the Harrison family consumed daily. The cook, an enslaved woman named Dinah, who had worked in the kitchen for 20 years, trusted the flour she received from the mill implicitly, never questioning its quality or safety, because Elijah's reputation for producing excellent flour was unimpeachable. Dinah received the first contaminated bag in mid-July and began using it immediately for the household's baking. Richard Harrison preferred fresh bread at both breakfast and dinner, consuming perhaps 4 or 5 slices daily as part of meals that also included meat, vegetables, and other foods. His wife, Elizabeth, ate similar amounts, while their 3 children consumed bread at most meals as well. This daily consumption pattern meant that the contaminated flour would be eaten steadily over the week or two it took the household to exhaust a 50-pound bag, after which Elijah would provide another contaminated batch to continue the poisoning. The first week produced no noticeable effects, which was exactly what Elijah expected and wanted. The toxic compounds needed to accumulate in Harrison's body over time before symptoms would appear, building up gradually through daily consumption of small doses rather than causing immediate acute illness. Elijah continued his normal mill operations, grinding both contaminated batches for the Harrison household and safe batches for other purposes, maintaining the careful separation between the two types of product while showing no external indication that anything had changed in his work routine. By late July, Elijah had delivered 3 contaminated bags to the household kitchen, representing approximately 150 pounds of flour containing 3 pounds of ground toxic seeds. Harrison had been consuming this contaminated bread for nearly 3 weeks, eating perhaps 2 or 3 slices daily that collectively delivered small but cumulative doses of poison into his system. The master showed no symptoms yet, continuing his normal activities of managing plantation operations and making periodic trips to Savannah for business and gambling. Elijah monitored Harrison's condition through the network of enslaved house servants who saw the master daily and who would notice if he began showing signs of illness. The house workers reported nothing unusual during late July. Harrison appeared healthy, maintaining his normal appetite and energy levels. This lack of immediate effect confirmed that Elijah's contamination ratio was appropriately conservative, creating slow accumulation rather than rapid poisoning that might trigger medical investigation. Through August, Elijah maintained his patient campaign, grinding contaminated flour weekly and delivering it to the kitchen where Dinah continued using it for the household's baking. Harrison consumed the poisoned bread daily, never suspecting that the food he enjoyed was systematically introducing toxins that were building up in his organs faster than his body could eliminate them. The accumulation was invisible and symptomless during this early phase, but Elijah understood that eventually the toxic load would reach levels where Harrison's body would begin showing the strain. The other enslaved workers on the plantation had begun to notice something different about Elijah during those summer months, though they couldn't identify what had changed. He performed his mill work with the same competence he had always shown, maintained appropriate deference toward white overseers and family members, and gave no obvious indication of planning or executing anything beyond his normal duties. But some of the older workers who had known Elijah for years sensed a quality of focused determination in him that hadn't been present before Marcus's sale, a sense that he was working toward some purpose he kept carefully hidden. A few people approached Elijah quietly to express sympathy about Marcus's sale and to ask whether he had received any news about his son's circumstances in Mississippi. Elijah would respond that he had heard nothing and didn't expect to, understanding that enslaved people sold away rarely had opportunity to send word back to families they had been separated from. These conversations never touched on what Elijah was actually doing, but the careful ambiguity in his responses suggested to perceptive listeners that he hadn't simply accepted Marcus's loss with resigned passivity. The summer heat of Georgia made mill work physically demanding, the grinding stones generating additional warmth that combined with ambient temperature to create conditions that left Elijah exhausted by day's end. But the work also provided rhythm and focus that helped him maintain the patience necessary for slow poisoning that required months to accomplish its purpose. Each bag of contaminated flour represented progress toward justice for Marcus's sale, each delivery to the kitchen another step in the gradual process of killing the man who had destroyed Elijah's family to pay gambling debts. By the end of August, Harrison had been consuming contaminated bread for approximately 7 weeks, eating flour that contained ground toxic seeds in every loaf Dinah baked for the household. The cumulative dose Harrison had ingested was approaching levels where Elijah expected symptoms to begin manifesting, though the exact timeline remained uncertain because Elijah had no way to know precisely how Harrison's body was processing and accumulating the toxins. The livestock deaths he had observed years earlier suggested that visible illness would appear sometime between 2 and 3 months of regular exposure, but individual variation meant the timeline could be shorter or longer, depending on Harrison's particular physiology. The first visible symptoms appeared in early September, approximately 9 weeks after Elijah had begun contaminating the Harrison household flour. Richard Harrison complained to his wife Elizabeth about persistent stomach discomfort and unusual fatigue that made even routine plantation management tasks feel exhausting. Elizabeth attributed these complaints initially to the late summer heat and to Richard's ongoing stress about financial matters, particularly the gambling debts he had incurred earlier in the year. She suggested he rest more and perhaps reduce his consumption of whiskey, which she had long believed contributed to various health problems he experienced periodically. Richard dismissed his wife's concerns initially, insisting that minor digestive upset didn't warrant changing his habits or seeking medical attention. He continued eating his normal meals, including the bread made from Elijah's contaminated flour, each slice delivering additional toxins into a body whose organs were already struggling to process accumulated poison from 2 months of regular consumption. The stomach discomfort persisted and gradually worsened, progressing from occasional unpleasant sensation to more constant pain that interfered with Richard's ability to focus on plantation business. By mid-September, the symptoms had expanded beyond digestive problems to include progressive weakness that Richard could no longer attribute to heat or temporary indisposition. He found himself becoming winded during activities that should have been easy, experiencing muscle fatigue that made climbing stairs or walking extended distances feel like significant exertion. His appetite began declining as nausea accompanied the stomach pain, making meals less appealing and causing him to eat smaller portions than he normally would. Elizabeth became sufficiently concerned by her husband's condition that she insisted he consult Dr. Henry Mitchell, the physician who attended the Harrison family and who practiced medicine in the nearest town, approximately 10 miles from the plantation. Mitchell arrived in late September to examine Richard, asking detailed questions about symptoms, their onset, and any changes in diet or routine that might explain the illness. Richard described the stomach pain, the fatigue, the loss of appetite, and the general sense of physical decline he had been experiencing over the previous month. Dr. Mitchell conducted a thorough examination by the standards of 1846 medical practice, checking Richard's pulse and temperature, examining his tongue and eyes for signs of disease, palpating his abdomen to check for abnormal masses or tenderness. The physician found nothing obviously wrong beyond the symptoms Richard had described: no fever suggesting infection, no obvious growths or abnormalities, no signs of acute disease that would explain the progressive decline. Mitchell's diagnosis reflected the limitations of medical knowledge in the mid-19th century, which lacked understanding of toxicology, nutritional deficiencies, or many of the disease processes that could cause the symptoms Richard exhibited. The physician concluded that Richard suffered from a digestive disorder of uncertain origin, possibly related to stress, dietary habits, or some constitutional weakness that had made him vulnerable to illness. Mitchell prescribed treatments that were standard for such cases: bloodletting to rebalance bodily humors, various tonics containing mercury and other substances believed to have medicinal properties, and dietary restrictions that emphasized bland foods believed to be easier on troubled digestion. Elijah learned of this medical consultation through house servants who discussed the doctor's visit and diagnosis among themselves and who shared information with other enslaved workers during evening hours in the quarters. The news that Harrison was ill enough to require medical attention suggested to Elijah that the poisoning was progressing as intended, creating symptoms severe enough to cause concern, but not so acute that doctors would suspect deliberate contamination. Mitchell's diagnosis of digestive disorder was exactly the kind of misattribution Elijah had hoped for, an explanation that attributed symptoms to natural causes rather than to the contaminated flour Harrison consumed daily. The prescribed treatments would actually worsen Harrison's condition rather than improving it, a fact that Elijah understood even if the physicians didn't. Bloodletting would weaken an already compromised body, reducing its ability to cope with the ongoing toxic assault from contaminated bread. Mercury compounds in the tonics would add their own poisonous effects to the plant toxins Elijah was introducing through flour. The bland diet might reduce stomach irritation slightly, but it wouldn't address the fundamental problem of cumulative poisoning that was progressively damaging Harrison's organs. Through late September and into October, Harrison's condition continued deteriorating despite following Dr. Mitchell's recommendations faithfully. The stomach pain intensified to the point where eating became genuinely difficult, though Harrison forced himself to consume at least some food at each meal, including the bread that was slowly killing him. The fatigue deepened until Richard spent increasing amounts of time resting in his study or bedroom, unable to maintain the active management of plantation operations he had previously considered essential to proper oversight. His weight began dropping noticeably as the combination of reduced appetite and ongoing toxic damage affected his body's ability to maintain normal mass. Elizabeth watched her husband waste away over the course of weeks, becoming increasingly alarmed by the visible evidence of serious illness that didn't respond to medical treatment. She pressed Mitchell to consult with other physicians or to suggest alternative treatments that might prove more effective than the bloodletting and tonics that seemed to be accomplishing nothing. Mitchell arranged for consultation with Dr. Samuel Preston, a more experienced physician from Savannah, who had studied medicine at schools in Philadelphia and who brought more current knowledge than rural practitioners like Mitchell typically possessed. Preston arrived in mid-October to examine Richard, conducting an even more thorough evaluation than Mitchell had performed. He tested Richard's urine for signs of kidney disease, examined stool samples for evidence of digestive disorders, and questioned the patient extensively about every aspect of his symptoms and their progression. Preston's more sophisticated medical training allowed him to recognize that Richard's symptoms suggested systemic poisoning rather than simple digestive disorder. But the limitations of 1846 toxicology meant he couldn't identify the specific toxin or its source. The physician asked Richard about potential exposure to industrial chemicals, about whether he had consumed any unusual foods or medicines, about whether anyone else in the household was experiencing similar symptoms. Richard's answers to these questions all suggested no obvious source of contamination. He hadn't worked with chemicals, hadn't eaten anything unusual, and was the only household member showing signs of serious illness. The fact that Richard was the only seriously ill household member was actually significant, though neither Preston nor Mitchell understood its implications for identifying the poisoning's source. Elizabeth and the children had also been eating bread made from contaminated flour, but they consumed smaller quantities than Richard did, and their bodies were processing the toxins differently based on individual physiology and body weight. Elizabeth showed mild symptoms, occasional stomach upset and some fatigue, but nothing approaching the severity of Richard's condition. The children appeared largely unaffected, their younger, more resilient bodies apparently better able to cope with the low-level toxic exposure. This pattern of differential impact should have suggested selective poisoning targeting Richard specifically, but Preston interpreted it instead as evidence that Richard possessed some constitutional vulnerability that made him more susceptible to whatever illness was affecting him. The physician prescribed additional treatments, including stronger purgatives to clear Richard's digestive system and different tonics formulated to address what Preston believed might be liver dysfunction based on the yellowing tinge Richard's skin had begun showing. These new treatments proved no more effective than Mitchell's earlier prescriptions, and in fact contributed additional stress to Richard's already failing organs. The purgatives caused severe diarrhea that dehydrated Richard and weakened him further, while the tonics introduced new chemical substances that his compromised liver couldn't process effectively. Elijah learned details of these medical interventions through the house servant network and understood with grim satisfaction that the physician's efforts were actually accelerating Harrison's decline rather than slowing it. Through late October, Elijah continued grinding contaminated flour and delivering it to the household kitchen, maintaining the steady poisoning that had now been ongoing for nearly 4 months. He had initially planned to stop the contamination once Harrison showed serious symptoms, but the master's continued survival despite obvious illness suggested that higher cumulative doses might be necessary to ensure death rather than merely debilitating sickness. Elijah adjusted his approach, slightly increasing the ratio of toxic seeds to wheat in the flour batches he prepared during October, raising the proportion from 1 to 50 to approximately 1 to 40. This increased contamination accelerated the toxic accumulation in Richard's body, pushing his failing organs closer to the point where they would no longer be able to sustain life. The higher doses were still subtle enough that the flour's taste remained acceptable to household members who consumed bread made from it, but the cumulative effect on Richard, who ate more bread than anyone else and whose body was already severely compromised, was devastating. By early November, Richard had become bedridden, too weak to leave his room except for brief periods when servants helped him to a chair near the window, where he could look out over the plantation he was no longer capable of managing. His weight loss had progressed to the point where his body appeared skeletal, the flesh wasted away to reveal bone structure beneath skin that had taken on a grayish-yellow color, suggesting multiple organ systems were failing. He could eat only small amounts of soft food, though he continued consuming small portions of bread because it was one of the few foods his damaged digestive system could still tolerate, without immediate violent rejection. The bread that Richard ate during his final weeks was the same contaminated product Elijah had been grinding for months, each bite delivering additional poison to a body that had lost all capacity to defend against or eliminate the accumulating toxins. The irony that Harrison was being killed by the very food he found most palatable during his illness was lost on everyone except Elijah, who understood perfectly that the bread providing comfort to the dying master was actually the weapon ensuring his death would arrive sooner rather than later. Elizabeth had given up hope of her husband's recovery by this point, focusing instead on making him as comfortable as possible during what she recognized were his final days. She sat with Richard for hours each day, reading to him when he had strength to listen, and simply holding his hand when weakness made even conversation too exhausting. The intimacy of these deathbed vigils created something approaching genuine tenderness between husband and wife, whose relationship had often been strained by Richard's gambling and drinking. The house servants who attended Richard during his final illness treated him with professional competence, despite knowing that this was the man who had sold Marcus and many others to pay debts incurred through his own poor decisions. They brought food and water, helped him with bodily functions he could no longer manage independently, and maintained the fiction that their care stemmed from loyalty rather than from enslaved people's lack of choice about serving those who claimed to own them. Some of these servants understood or suspected that Richard's illness might not be entirely natural, though none possessed specific knowledge about what Elijah had done or how he had accomplished it. Elijah himself maintained careful distance from the main house during Richard's final decline, staying at the mill and performing his normal duties while receiving updates about the master's condition through the servant network. He felt no guilt about what he was doing, only grim determination to see the poisoning through to its conclusion. The image of Marcus's terrified face as the wagon had carried him away remained vivid in Elijah's memory, providing justification for every bag of contaminated flour he ground and every day closer to death that Richard moved. The question of whether Elizabeth and the children deserved to suffer Richard's loss troubled Elijah briefly during the final weeks, but he resolved it by recognizing that they had benefited from the system that enslaved him and Marcus, that they had enjoyed wealth and comfort built on the labor of people treated as property, and that Richard's death would at least prevent him from selling additional children away from their families, to pay future gambling debts. The children would grow up without their father, but that outcome seemed more just than allowing Richard to continue destroying enslaved families whenever his appetites created financial need. By mid-November, Richard's condition had deteriorated to the point where Dr. Preston acknowledged that death was imminent and that no further medical interventions would change that outcome. The physician recommended keeping Richard comfortable with laudanum to manage pain and allowing family members to say their farewells while the patient still retained enough consciousness to recognize them. Preston remained baffled by the illness that had killed his patient, unable to identify any specific disease or condition that explained the progressive organ failure Richard had experienced over 5 months of steady decline. Richard Harrison died on November 18, 1846, 5 months and 2 weeks after Elijah had begun contaminating the household flour with ground toxic seeds. The death came in the early morning hours, with Elizabeth at her husband's bedside holding his hand, as his breathing became increasingly shallow and irregular, before finally stopping altogether. Richard's final moments were peaceful, despite the months of suffering that had preceded them. The laudanum Dr. Preston had prescribed, ensuring that pain didn't accompany the master's transition from life to death. The official cause of death recorded by Dr. Preston was organ failure, resulting from a wasting disease of unknown origin, language that reflected the physician's genuine uncertainty about what had killed his patient, despite months of treatment and consultation with colleagues. Preston's death certificate made no mention of possible poisoning or contamination, because nothing in Richard's symptoms or in the progression of his illness had suggested deliberate action rather than natural disease. The timing, the gradual onset, the specific pattern of organ damage, all of it, appeared consistent with the kind of mysterious illnesses that occasionally claimed lives in an era when medical science understood relatively little about human physiology or the countless ways bodies could fail. The funeral was held 3 days later, a somber affair attended by neighboring plantation owners, local officials, and the minister who had baptized the Harrison children and who now conducted services committing their father to the earth. The eulogy praised Richard as a man of business acumen who had maintained his family's plantation successfully, making only brief and diplomatically vague reference to the gambling habits that had created periodic financial difficulties. Elizabeth wept openly during the service, her grief for her husband complicated by relief that his suffering had finally ended, and by uncertainty about her future as a widow responsible for managing an estate she had never been trained to oversee. The enslaved workers on the plantation attended the funeral as well, standing at appropriate distance from the white mourners and maintaining expressions of somber respect that gave no indication of their actual feelings about the master's death. Some felt genuine sorrow because Richard had been less brutal than many plantation owners, treating his enslaved workers with casual indifference rather than with the active cruelty that characterized some masters' behavior. Others felt satisfaction that the man who had sold their family members and friends had received what they viewed as appropriate punishment for those acts, though they were careful not to show such satisfaction in ways that might invite scrutiny or suspicion. Elijah stood among the other enslaved workers during the funeral service, his face showing appropriate gravity for the occasion. His internal response, a complex mixture of satisfaction that justice had been served and grief that remained raw over Marcus's loss. Richard's death wouldn't bring Marcus back, wouldn't undo the separation that had destroyed Elijah's family, but it at least ensured that the man responsible for that destruction had paid a price for his actions. The knowledge that Richard had died slowly and painfully from poison Elijah had ground into flour provided some measure of vindication, though it couldn't heal the wound that Marcus's absence had created. In the weeks following Richard's death, Elizabeth faced difficult decisions about the plantation's future management. She had no experience running agricultural operations and no desire to learn the complex details of cotton cultivation, grain milling, and the various other enterprises that generated the estate's income. Her late husband's brother Thomas offered to assume management responsibilities, moving from his own smaller plantation to oversee operations, while Elizabeth retained ownership and received proceeds from profitable operation. Thomas Harrison arrived in early December to begin his management role, and one of his first actions was reviewing the plantation's various operations to understand their current state and profitability. The mill particularly interested him because grain processing represented steady income, independent of cotton price fluctuations that made agricultural revenue unpredictable. Thomas visited the mill to meet Elijah and to observe the milling operations firsthand, asking questions about production capacity, customer base, and equipment maintenance needs. Elijah provided careful answers to Thomas's questions, demonstrating the expertise that had made him valuable to Richard and that would presumably make him equally valuable to the new manager. Thomas seemed impressed by Elijah's knowledge and by the mill's reputation for producing high-quality flour, indicating that he saw no reason to make changes to operations that appeared to be functioning well. The conversation included no mention of Richard's death or its possible causes, Thomas apparently accepting the medical explanation that his brother had succumbed to natural illness rather than to any deliberate action. Through late December and into early 1847, life on the Harrison plantation gradually returned to routines that resembled what had existed before Richard's illness, though with Thomas rather than Richard making management decisions and with Elizabeth maintaining a more withdrawn presence than she had shown when her husband was alive. The mill continued operating under Elijah's direction, grinding grain for the household and for customers whose patronage had sustained operations for years. But Elijah had discontinued the contamination immediately after Richard's death, returning to producing only safe flour for all purposes. The toxic seeds he had harvested and stored remained hidden beneath his cabin's floorboards, physical evidence of what he had done that would need to be destroyed carefully to eliminate any possibility of discovery. Over several weeks, Elijah disposed of these seeds by burning small quantities at a time in his cabin's fireplace, ensuring that the evidence of his weapon literally went up in smoke that left no trace except ashes indistinguishable from those produced by ordinary firewood. The story of Richard Harrison's mysterious death began spreading through enslaved communities across Georgia and into neighboring states almost immediately, carried by the invisible communication networks that connected black workers, despite the distances and legal restrictions designed to isolate them. The details evolved with each retelling, some versions emphasizing the divine justice of a master dying painfully after selling a teenage son, others focusing on the suspicious timing of illness that began shortly after Marcus's sale and ended with Richard's death 5 months later. A few of the more perceptive storytellers noted the significance of Elijah's position as miller, recognizing that control over grain and flour processing provided opportunities for contamination that would be nearly impossible to detect once grinding was complete. These versions of the story suggested, without quite stating explicitly, that Richard might have been poisoned through the very bread he ate daily, killed by the enslaved man whose expertise in milling had made the Harrison operation profitable for 18 years. The stories were told carefully, with enough ambiguity that they couldn't be used as evidence of actual knowledge about deliberate poisoning, but with enough detail that attentive listeners understood the implications clearly. Elijah became aware that people were discussing possible connections between his position, Marcus's sale, and Richard's subsequent death, but no one approached him directly to ask whether he had poisoned the master. The questions, when they came, were oblique and carefully phrased to allow multiple interpretations. An older enslaved man who worked in the fields might mention that Richard's illness had been very unfortunate, especially coming so soon after Marcus's departure. And would Elijah agree that sometimes misfortune followed those who destroyed families? Elijah would respond with equal ambiguity, observing that illness was unpredictable, and that death came to everyone eventually, though sometimes the timing seemed almost like Providence delivering justice that the law never would. These carefully ambiguous conversations served multiple purposes. They allowed enslaved workers to discuss resistance without creating evidence that could be used against them if white authorities investigated. They conveyed information about how specialized knowledge could be weaponized when circumstances demanded action, and they provided examples of how patience and expertise could achieve outcomes that direct confrontation could never accomplish, lessons that would be remembered and sometimes applied by others who found themselves in positions where they controlled what their enslavers consumed. Thomas Harrison proved to be a more attentive manager than his brother had been, visiting the mill regularly to observe operations and to discuss production with Elijah. These visits created some anxiety for Elijah initially, concern that closer oversight might reveal something about the contamination he had practiced for 5 months. But Thomas's interests were purely practical and economic. The new manager wanted to understand the mill's profitability and to ensure operations continued efficiently, showing no indication of suspecting that the mill had been the site of calculated murder just months earlier. Through the spring of 1847, Elijah maintained his normal operations while carefully observing Thomas's management style and his treatment of the plantation's enslaved workers. The new manager proved less inclined toward the gambling and heavy drinking that had characterized Richard's behavior, suggesting that the periodic financial crises that had led to Marcus's sale were less likely to recur. This relative stability meant that other enslaved families on the plantation faced reduced risk of sudden separation through sales forced by the master's need to cover gambling debts. But the stability also meant that Elijah was unlikely to secure freedom or significant improvement in his circumstances through any action Thomas might take voluntarily. Unlike some plantation owners who occasionally granted manumission to enslaved workers they particularly valued, Thomas showed no inclination toward such gestures, viewing enslaved people primarily as economic assets rather than as individuals whose service might deserve recognition beyond the minimal material support required to keep them productive. Elijah began considering whether to pursue escape to free states, understanding that remaining on the Harrison plantation meant spending the rest of his life in bondage, despite having successfully avenged Marcus's sale through Richard's murder. The knowledge that he had killed a master without being caught provided some satisfaction, but it couldn't replace the freedom that escape might offer if he could reach northern states where slavery was illegal and where he might rebuild some semblance of the life that had been destroyed when Marcus was sold. The practical obstacles to escape were substantial for a man of 37, with no connections to the underground railroad networks that helped fleeing enslaved people navigate routes north. Elijah would need to travel hundreds of miles through territory where his race made him automatically suspect, where slave patrols operated regularly, and where capture would result in return to the plantation and punishment severe enough to serve as warning to others who might contemplate flight. The risks were enormous, but continuing in slavery indefinitely, while knowing he had the courage and intelligence to have committed perfect murder, suggested that he might also possess the resources necessary to achieve escape. Through the summer of 1847, Elijah began quietly gathering information about routes north and about the networks that assisted escaping enslaved people. He spoke carefully with other workers who had knowledge of such matters, asking questions that appeared to be idle curiosity rather than serious planning. He learned that certain sympathetic white people in Georgia operated safe houses where fleeing enslaved people could hide temporarily, that certain river routes offered better chances of avoiding patrols than overland travel, and that reaching free states like Pennsylvania or Ohio typically required weeks or months of dangerous journey through hostile territory. The decision about whether to attempt escape remained unresolved through the fall of 1847, Elijah weighing the substantial risks against the potential for freedom and against the reality that remaining on the Harrison plantation meant accepting permanent bondage, despite his proven capacity for resistance. The murder he had committed demonstrated that enslaved people could strike back against their oppressors successfully when they possessed specialized knowledge and the patience to execute long-term plans. but it hadn't changed his fundamental legal status as property owned by the Harrison family. Other enslaved workers began treating Elijah with subtle deference that reflected their suspicions about what he had done and their respect for someone who had apparently achieved justice through intelligence rather than through violence that would have resulted in immediate retaliation. Young people learning skilled trades would sometimes seek Elijah's advice about their work. Conversations that often included oblique references to how knowledge could serve purposes beyond what masters intended and how patience could be more powerful than force when confronting overwhelming power differentials. Elijah responded to these approaches with the same careful ambiguity he had shown in discussing Richard's death, offering observations about the importance of truly mastering one's craft and about how complete understanding of processes like grinding or fermentation or any specialized skill created power that ownership couldn't entirely control. He would note that the person who decided what went into grain before it was ground, or what ingredients went into food before it was cooked, or what substances went into medicines before they were administered, held power that was often invisible to the people who consumed the final products, but that could be decisive when wielded with sufficient care and patience. Elijah Carter never attempted the escape he had contemplated during the year following Richard Harrison's death. The practical obstacles proved too daunting for a man approaching 40 with no network connections and no clear path toward free states, hundreds of miles distant through hostile territory. Instead, he remained on the Harrison plantation, continuing to operate the mill under Thomas's management, while carrying knowledge about Richard's murder that no one could ever prove, but that many suspected based on timing and circumstance. The years that followed brought gradual changes to the plantation and to Elijah's circumstances within it. Thomas Harrison proved to be a competent if uninspired manager, maintaining operations at levels that generated steady income, without pursuing the kind of expansion or improvement that might have increased profitability at cost of greater risk. The mill continued producing flour under Elijah's direction, its reputation for quality sustained through the same expertise Elijah had demonstrated for more than 2 decades. Elijah lived alone in his cabin near the mill, the structure that had once housed both him and Marcus, now containing only a solitary middle-aged man whose family had been destroyed by slavery's casual cruelties. He formed no new close relationships, maintaining cordial but distant interactions with other enslaved workers while focusing his emotional energy on work that at least provided purpose, even if it couldn't provide freedom or restore what had been lost. Through the 1850s, as national tensions over slavery intensified and the country moved toward the Civil War that would eventually destroy the institution, Elijah continued his daily routines of grinding grain and producing flour. He was aware of the broader political conflicts through conversations with other enslaved workers and through occasional comments from white people discussing events they assumed their enslaved workers didn't understand or care about. But these large-scale political movements felt distant from the immediate reality of daily survival and the routines that structured plantation life. Elijah died in 1859 at age 49 from pneumonia that developed after he was caught in a winter storm while transporting flour to a customer. The illness progressed rapidly despite treatment attempts, his body weakened by decades of hard labor proving unable to fight off the infection. He was buried in the enslaved workers' cemetery on the Harrison plantation, his grave marked only by a wooden board that would decay within years, leaving no permanent record of where the miller who had poisoned his master lay beneath Georgia soil. The story of Elijah and the contaminated flour survived him, preserved through oral tradition among black communities who understood the significance of what he had accomplished, even if official history would never acknowledge it. The mill he had operated for 27 years continued functioning under new management after his death, grinding grain through the final years before the Civil War, and then through the conflict itself, when Union forces moving through Georgia destroyed many plantation structures, but left mills standing because they served essential functions regardless of who controlled the territory. Before we end, please hit the subscribe button to make my day. and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The physical evidence of Elijah's crime had vanished completely within months of Richard Harrison's death. The toxic seeds burned to ashes, the contaminated flour consumed and digested, the grinding stones that had pulverized poison along with wheat showing no trace of what had passed between them. The mill itself stood for another 30 years after Elijah's death, before finally collapsing from age and neglect in the 1890s, its massive grinding stones eventually being repurposed for other construction projects or left to sink slowly into the Georgia earth. But the legend persisted in stories told by people who had been enslaved on the Harrison plantation or on neighboring estates, stories about the miller who had ground more than wheat into his master's flour, who had used 18 years of expertise to commit perfect murder that appeared to everyone except the perpetrator as nothing more than tragic illness, claiming a plantation owner in his prime. The details varied with each telling, but the core narrative remained consistent. Elijah Carter had killed Richard Harrison to avenge Marcus's sale, using knowledge of grain and toxic seeds to poison the master through daily bread that sustained life for most people, but delivered death to the one person Elijah intended to kill. The story served purposes beyond simply preserving memory of one man's resistance. It conveyed lessons about how specialized knowledge could become power when circumstances demanded action, how patience could achieve what violence never could, and how enslaved people possessed agency and capacity for sophisticated planning that the system was designed to deny but could never entirely suppress. Young people learning skilled trades heard Elijah's story and understood that their expertise served purposes beyond making their enslavers wealthy, that knowledge itself was a form of freedom that ownership couldn't fully control. Elijah Carter's life and death remain footnotes in official histories of the Harrison plantation and of Georgia's antebellum period, mentioned only in property records that listed him as an asset transferred between owners, and eventually lost to death that reduced the estate's value by whatever amount a skilled miller was worth in 1859. No monument marks his grave, no historical marker explains his significance, no museum exhibit explores how he transformed flour milling into murder weapon that fooled trained physicians and left no evidence except the stories enslaved people told among themselves. But those stories endure, passed down through generations, who recognized that history is written not just in official documents, but in the oral traditions of people whose resistance took forms that power never anticipated and couldn't effectively prevent. Elijah Carter ground grain for 27 years, and for 5 months of that time he ground something more justice, delivered one contaminated bag at a time through bread that killed the man who sold his son for gambling debts, proving that the miller who controlled what became flour held power that masters never suspected until it was far too late to defend against it. The Harrison plantation itself survived the Civil War relatively intact compared to many Georgia estates that were burned or destroyed during Sherman's march through the state in 1864. The mill continued operating through the conflict and into the Reconstruction period, though under changed circumstances as formerly enslaved workers negotiated wages for labor that had previously been extracted through bondage. The grinding stones that Elijah had operated for nearly 3 decades turned under new hands, producing flour that sustained communities transitioning from slavery to the complex and often brutal realities of freedom in the post-war South. Thomas Harrison maintained ownership of the property through the war years and beyond, adapting to the economic transformations that replaced slave labor with sharecropping and wage work that often proved nearly as exploitative as the system it had nominally replaced. The mill remained profitable because grain processing served essential functions regardless of political changes, and the Harrison flour continued to be sold to customers who valued quality without concerning themselves with the historical circumstances of its production. The story of Elijah Carter and Richard Harrison's poisoning circulated through black communities in Georgia and beyond during the decades following emancipation, becoming part of the oral tradition that preserved knowledge about resistance and agency during slavery. former enslaved workers who had known Elijah or who had lived on the Harrison plantation during the 1840s, would occasionally share the story with younger generations, explaining how the quiet miller had used his expertise to avenge his son's sale through contaminated flour that killed a master while appearing to be natural illness. These tellings emphasized the sophistication of Elijah's method and the patience required to execute poisoning that took 5 months to accomplish its purpose. The storytellers would explain how Elijah had harvested toxic seeds from forest plants, had ground them with wheat into powder that looked and tasted normal, had delivered contaminated flour specifically to the master's household while keeping other customers' flour pure, and had maintained perfect external composure while systematically killing the man who had destroyed his family. The stories served as education about how knowledge could become power, and about how enslaved people had found ways to resist, even when direct confrontation would have been suicidal. Researchers documenting formerly enslaved people's experiences during the early 20th century occasionally heard references to the Harrison plantation miller who had supposedly poisoned his master, though the details were always presented with careful ambiguity that made it impossible to verify whether the story represented actual events or legendary narrative created to illustrate broader truths about resistance and agency. The researchers would note these accounts in their records, usually with commentary suggesting that such stories reflected enslaved people's desires for justice rather than documenting actual murders, unable or unwilling to recognize that both things could be true simultaneously. The physical site where Elijah's cabin had stood near the mill was gradually overtaken by vegetation after the structures collapsed in the late 19th century, the wood rotting, and the stone foundations sinking into earth that showed no trace of the building where a father had planned his master's murder, while grieving for a son he would never see again. The mill itself lasted longer, remaining functional until the 1880s, when more modern grinding equipment made the old water-powered operation obsolete. But eventually it too fell into disrepair and was demolished, its massive grinding stones broken apart or buried on site. The Harrison family sold the plantation in 1903, more than 50 years after Richard's death. The property divided among multiple buyers who converted the land to different agricultural uses that bore little resemblance to the cotton and grain operations that had characterized the antebellum period. The new owners knew nothing of the plantation's history beyond basic facts about previous ownership, certainly nothing about a miller who had poisoned a master through contaminated flour, or about a teenage boy sold to Mississippi to pay gambling debts. The story of Elijah Carter reminds us that resistance to slavery took countless forms beyond the dramatic rebellions and escapes that dominate popular historical memory. It illustrates how specialized knowledge acquired through forced labor could be weaponized by people who understood systems well enough to exploit their vulnerabilities, how patience could achieve what violence never could, and how enslaved people possessed agency and capacity for sophisticated action that the legal framework defining them as property was designed to deny but could never entirely suppress. The flour that Elijah ground for 27 years sustained thousands of people, providing nutrition and economic value that made the Harrison mill profitable and respected. But for 5 months in 1846, that same flour became a delivery system for justice that the legal system would never provide, contaminated so carefully with ground toxic seeds that physicians examining the dying master never suspected deliberate poisoning rather than natural illness. The grinding stones crushed wheat and poison together into indistinguishable powder, and the bread baked from that flour fed a master who believed he was being nourished, even as he was being systematically killed by the enslaved man, whose expertise he had relied upon for 18 years. The lesson embedded in Elijah's story, that the person who controls what others consume holds power. Those others cannot fully defend against resonated through generations of people whose survival depended on understanding how to exploit whatever small advantages their positions provided within systems designed to oppress them. The miller who knew which seeds were toxic, the cook who understood which ingredients were dangerous, the water carrier who controlled contamination, the cheesemaker who cultivated deadly bacteria. All of these represented variations on the same theme of specialized knowledge, transformed into weapon when circumstances demanded action that more direct resistance could never accomplish. Elijah Carter ground grain until pneumonia claimed him in 1859, his death occurring in the same cabin where he had once lived with Marcus and where he had planned Richard Harrison's murder 13 years earlier. He died knowing he had avenged his son's sale through patient poisoning that had never been detected or punished, but also knowing that Marcus remained lost to him, sold into Mississippi cotton fields where teenage boys rarely survived more than a few years under conditions that made Georgia plantation slavery seem merciful by comparison. The revenge had been successful, the murder perfect in its execution and concealment, but it couldn't undo the separation that had destroyed Elijah's family or restore what slavery had taken from him across 49 years of bondage that ended only with death. The grinding stones are silent now, buried or scattered across Georgia landscape that shows no trace of the mill where they once turned, crushing grain and occasionally grinding poison into flour that sustained and sometimes killed those who consumed bread made from it.